All right. We're all here today to talk about yoga injuries. Um, so I hope that you've brought questions, ideas, insights, wisdom to share on the topic. We have lots to talk about today. We're going to talk about how common injuries are in yoga and how they commonly occur. Although we'll get into it, it's hard to get accurate numbers. We're going to talk about how we might reduce the risk of injuries in our classes by encouraging and educating and creating space for enthusiastic and safe exploration, both on and off the mat. And I think key to our discussion is an understanding that all activities have a risk of injury, just as no activity or little activity, like sedentary life, also carries a risk of injury or illness. However, of course, we want to reduce the risk of injuries as much as possible in our yoga classes. And this discussion is aimed at yoga teachers and yoga teachers in training, but I hope perhaps your yoga participants find it useful as well. A little bit of an overview of this has become a very long discussion, but a little overview of all the topics that I think might be important to begin this injury discussion. That is injury rates, the biopsychosocial factors in injury risk management, culture and mindset, educating our students, invitational teaching strategies, retiring some old yoga models. And I also want to talk about what to do if an injury happens in class. So lots to talk about today. We'll start by talking a little bit about injury rates. But before we dig into that, it's important for you to know that I'm not an academic. And so my ability to interpret research is limited. I've done my best, but I'll also include in the transcript notes some links to research and resources so you can have a read yourself. So that's one note. Another note is the topic of yoga injuries can get quite heated. And there are very strong views on both sides of the spectrum. There's the yoga is the safest activity you can ever do camp, and that yoga injuries are rampant and this is an emergency camp. And I tend to sit in the middle, understanding again that all movement has risks, and hope that we can continue to learn together how to reduce that risk so that we can all move as safely and mindfully and joyfully as possible. Also, when we talk about injury rates, it's important to understand the obstacles. So we don't have clear data on yoga injuries. And some of those obstacles are the usual issues with any yoga research. When we're talking about yoga research, which form of yoga, which teacher, which students, which environment? And those are just some of the factors that challenge our ability to study yoga the way we study other things. And a few other obstacles to reporting on yoga injuries are that there's no like standardized system of reporting, first of all. Also, a lot of yoga injuries go unreported, either because there's no clear pathway for reporting, or students might feel that they're to blame for their injury and not report, or they just don't see a purpose in reporting. So when we think about all the reports that have been gathered on yoga injuries, they're definitely not gathering all of them. Another obstacle is that, as we know, yoga varies wildly between different styles and different forms of yoga. So it's really hard to draw conclusions from one style of yoga and apply it to another directly. And finally, injuries often have multiple causes or causative factors. And that might include previous injuries, someone's anatomical or structural factors, age, psychological factors, their skill level. And while we might pinpoint a certain activity as causing an injury, it is often far more complex. So those are some of the obstacles that we face in having really clear data on injury rates in yoga, but there is some research. So I want to share a little bit of that with you. So the first study I'm going to mention is a cross-sectional survey done in Germany in 2016 with about 1,700 participants, so a good size of participants. And their findings were yoga is as safe or safer when compared to other movement types. In this research, 1 in 5 adult yoga participants reported at least one acute adverse effect in their yoga practice, and 1 in 10 reported at least one chronic adverse effect. And these are mainly musculoskeletal effects. So in general, 20% will experience an acute injury and 10% will experience a chronic injury. The most commonly reported yoga practices that were associated with acute adverse effects were from handstand, shoulder stand, and headstand. So I think that's worth noting. Yeah. The risk of chronic adverse effects was higher in participants with chronic illnesses, and those practicing only by self-study without supervision, so without support from a teacher. And as I said, most reported adverse effects in this study concern the musculoskeletal system, and 76.9% of acute cases and 51.6% of chronic cases reached full recovery. So on average, in this particular study, they found 0.6 injuries per 1,000 hours of practice were reported. So less than 1 injury per 1,000 hours of practice. And they found that power yoga users reported the highest rates. So that's from one study, and I'll include the link in the transcript notes so you can have a read of that yourself. The second study I want to mention is a systemic review of about 7,500 participants. This was published in 2018 on injury rates. And I think there was 5 studies that were explored in this. One study found overall injury incidence is just over 1 injury per 1,000 hours. Overall, this study found the injury rates in yoga was about 7%. Unfortunately, there were some obstacles in this review. 4 of the 5 studies didn't specify what type of yoga, but one study did focus solely on Ashtanga yoga. So we can learn from that study. The majority of injuries in that study of Ashtanga yoga were lower extremity injuries. And one of the findings was, regardless of the specific school of yoga, poses that exceeded normal joint motion were a higher risk for musculoskeletal damage and pain. So that's something to know. Overall, from kind of a general sampling of studies, I thought there was a few conclusions to consider. Number one, how often and how intensely you practice is a strong factor. Number two, the lifetime prevalence of acute injuries is a really wide range, from 21 to 62%. The higher number being associated with that first factor, more frequent, more intense practice. And number three, the most common adverse events reported were sprains and strains. And the most common poses associated with those adverse events were headstand, shoulder stand, handstand, lotus pose, and then generally forward folds and back bends. Okay. So frequency, intensity, and particular poses seem to be more commonly associated with adverse events. So again, I'll share some links for you so that you can continue to have a read for yourself. I mean, it's obvious this is an area to continue to pay attention to, particularly as yoga research becomes more refined, and we learn more about injury rates and risks. Okay. I'm of an age where I seem to spend a lot of my time going, why does this hurt? Was it yoga? Was it the garden? Did I sleep wrong? Looking for a why. And often, as I said before, there's multiple causative factors: age, hormones, repetitive activities, the way that the habits I have in the way that I move. I was just talking to my mom about this the other day. I come from a family of straight leg bender overs. We don't bend our knees when we're in the garden. That's a factor, like how we uniquely choose to move. And I playing the why game doesn't seem to be all that useful. But I think in terms of yoga practice, it is a good question to be asking: is there something in my yoga practice that is causing me discomfort? Am I coming away from yoga practice feeling good, and then a little later I'm like, oh, there's that thing again? And does that need to be addressed? Yeah. It's a really good question. Acute injuries, we tend to know a lot more clearly what happened. With chronic injuries, sometimes there's a lot of factors, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah. So should I be worried about injuries in my yoga class? The short answer is no. Don't be worried, but do employ safe teaching strategies. And one of the reasons I say don't be worried is that worry can be its own causative factor in people's experience of pain, right? And we'll talk about that in a sec. But first, I want to say that it's an important thing to keep in mind that people don't want to hurt themselves. And generally, they won't hurt themselves. They won't go about hurting themselves unless they think the pain is normal, or they think it's expected, or they think the pain is just an obstacle to a goal. And if we as teachers insist on a goal, that could be a causative factor. So rather, we could focus on the journey, and that may reduce the risk of injury, right? So that's something to keep in mind. People don't want to hurt themselves. They don't want to be in pain. And we don't want to be the reason that they're in pain, because we created a culture that encouraged pain, right? And that's another thing we'll talk about in a moment. So in my own teaching practice, I spent some time thinking about categories, because I love a good category. And there's kind of three basic factors that I see in my own teaching practice that could potentially increase injury risk. And those three things are repetition or lack of variety, ignoring your body in favor of the teacher or the style or the ideas about good yoga, and number three, not understanding individual difference. So let's dig into that. So the first thing, repetition. The risk of repetitive strain injuries can rise when people are doing too much of one type of movement, and as well not balancing it with other movement forms. And by this, I mean a couple of things. Types of movements. So for example, too much stretching, not enough strengthening. Specific movements. So like too much hip flexion or forward folding, not enough hip extension. And then specific activities like all yoga all the time, with no variety of movement in your life. An example of this repetitive risk can be found in athletics, where studies show that multi-sport athletes have less injuries than single sport athletes. And if you'll allow me to infer, the same in yoga, we would be wise to add activities to our movement practice that complement our practice and that help to reduce that repetitive risk, as well as our overall health. So what might that look like? Of course, have your beloved yoga practice, but also consider adding lifting heavy things. So resistance training of some kind, weights, machines, tubing, kettlebells, body weight, getting your heart rate up. So walk, run, roll, cycle, swim, dance, skate. And another thing that I'll add is moving at different paces and in different directions or on different terrains. So like hiking, tennis, basketball, ping pong, plyometrics, martial arts. You don't have to do all of these activities, but maybe there's a couple activities in there that you're like, yeah, that really these are activities I love, and that's going to complement my yoga practice. This is important for your students to be educated about, but also who does the most yoga? It's us, yoga teachers, right? So I think it's important for us as teachers to be sure to weave some complementary movements into our life. You're not cheating on yoga. You have an open relationship with yoga. You can go ahead and do other activities. Yoga won't be at home crying, right? So bring in those things that complement what you're doing in your yoga practice. So all of that's kind of under the banner of repetition. The second factor I wanted to talk about was kind of the like, listen to me, not your body kind of attitude that we used to see in yoga a lot. And our risk of injury is increased when students feel they should listen to our guidance exclusively rather than tuning into their own bodies. And not just what's happening in our classes, but I think it's good to understand that students may have been taught either overtly or covertly to override their own body's messages in favor of the alignment ideas of the teacher or the perceived notions of what good yoga looks like, right? And our risk of injury is also increased when students feel that they should or they have to try out new or fancy movements because their teacher's excited about them, which doesn't mean you can't offer new and fancy things in your classes. But be sure to be offering options and versions and varying intensity and complexity of movement in your class without putting a higher value on fancier or trickier movements, right? The third factor is individual difference. So many students are going to come to class thinking that all bodies should do the same things and look the same when they're doing yoga. And so it's important for us to do a bit of educating to teach our students about the differences in body design and structure, the difference between tension and compression, where's there still room to stretch, and where have you met your bony limit. And that all bodies come in all different shapes and sizes and abilities. You might have hypermobile students in class who can easily tuck their legs behind their head on their first yoga class. And you might have hypomobile students in your class who've been practicing for decades and will never touch their toes. And it's important for students to understand that that's not a moral problem, and that they should be encouraged to practice their own yoga without thinking that one is better or more valued or more spiritual or more moral than the other. One of my teachers used to say, if flexibility was a measure of your spirituality, all gymnasts and all circus artists would be enlightened, right? So it's important for students to understand that flexibility does not equal good at yoga or a more spiritual person or a more enlightened person. Those ideas sound familiar to thoughts you might have had when you began yoga. Like, okay, all right, I'll be accepting and that'll get me closer to my toes. Look, it's interesting. Like, yes, we all have a certain capacity for flexibility and some have more capacity than others. And we'll talk about this in a moment. Like, acceptance and contentment could be, the research on this is sketchy, but could be really important for improving your flexibility. That when you go at your flexibility, like, damn you body, I'm getting stretchier. Your body's like, you are a risky person, and I'm just gonna hold on to things because you're doing unsafe stuff, and I need to stabilize. So again, the research on that, it goes up and down. It's a little bit sketchy at the moment, but attitude could play a role in those less stretchy people actually getting more stretchy. Yeah, something to think about. So your little negotiating strategy might really work there. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about culture and mindset. So participants will come to class with their own history of movement, their own ideas about their body, and their own paradigms like all or nothing, no pain, no gain, or even what it means to be good at yoga. So we've got to do our best as teachers to counter that with messaging that encourages a culture of exploration rather than perfection, or experience rather than achievement. To have an internal experience of yoga rather than focusing always on the external experience of yoga. So that's something important when it comes to the culture that you create in your class. Something else important to remember is there's a thing called the nocebo effect, which is like when we use language like to protect your spine, you could damage your knees, this is a risky movement. You've probably heard of the placebo effect. The nocebo effect is the opposite. The nocebo effect happens when we have a negative outcome because we believe we'll have a negative outcome. So, in other words, we are more likely to experience an adverse effect if we're worried about an adverse effect. So, as teachers, we want to be aware of the impact of using that language. Protect your back. If you do this or if you don't do this, you could damage XYZ, or like this is a riskier movement. You want to aim to provide safety cues and guidance without creating a sense of danger or a sense of harm. So that's the nocebo effect. And so that's important in your class culture. Another important thing in your class culture is to change some of those paradigms or to address some of those paradigms that students come to class with. And my Thai yoga massage teacher used to talk about this all the time. The no pain, no gain rule, when we're giving a Thai massage, switches to have pain, no gain. That there's no gain to be gotten from painful stretches, from a painful massage. And I think that that's also a useful thing to bring into our classes. If you have pain, this is no longer yoga. This is no longer an experience of mindful movement, breathing relaxation, or liberation, or enlightenment, whatever. So it's up to us to change those paradigms. And some of the ways that we can do that are to have open communication. And so as teachers, we can work to create a culture of free communication. Do your students feel able to speak up about discomfort or about injuries? Do your students feel free to ask about options or versions or alternative poses without feeling that they're going to show themselves up as not yogic enough or not good at yoga? Do they feel safe to approach you with safety concerns? So I think it's worth taking time to think about how can you create that kind of culture in your class, or at least think about what kind of culture do I want to create in my class, right? And hopefully it's not a boot camp style culture, right? One of the things we're helping students to learn is body awareness, is to be able to listen to the messages of their body and identify them, right? And that can be really hard for students. I've had that experience many times where students say, what should it feel like here? Like, I don't know. It's going to feel different in your body. There's not a right way to feel, but there's a spectrum, and we don't want to feel nothing. We don't want to feel too much. And like, we want to feel something in the middle. But even the way students language the sensations in their body is interesting to me. Like they'll say, well, I'm feeling a pain. And I think, oh, you should stop. And then when we dig in further, if I have the opportunity to have a further conversation, they're using the word pain for what I would call a stretch. And so a lot of that is like giving people time and space to have an embodied experience that they might never have had before. They might never have had this kind of communication with their own body without being told how to feel, without being told, without putting labels on their body. And that can take a lot of time. And that's what we're there for, to give students that time and space to begin to learn about their body. And so part of this is just really about, the ongoing process of educating our students. And some of the ways we can do that are to talk about yoga philosophy and ethics as it relates to safe practice. What might that include? Ahimsa, non-harming; satya, truthfulness; brahmacharya, energy management; santosha, contentment. So consistently bringing this into your class, perhaps as class themes or little moments of discussion, can help students understand the ethics and the approach of how we might practice. I think it can be useful to teach students about the edge space. And this is the space kind of between comfort and discomfort, when we're challenging ourselves either with movement or with rest, without moving into discomfort. And you could posit this as a practice of tapas, or disciplined intensity, right? Another thing I tend to talk about with students is to feel a stretch in the belly of the muscle, not in the joint. And I think that's a good general guideline, especially for those students who are new to this kind of communication with their body, to know the difference between, for instance, if I'm in a forward fold, am I feeling a stretch in the belly of the hamstrings, or am I feeling a stretch right at the insertion point at the sit bones, right? And one is obviously preferable over the other. And we need to teach our students about that. I think it's useful to discuss with your students. You don't have to have long discussions, but you could talk to your students about how you sequence a class to balance strengthening and stretching, and to stretch all sides of a joint, right? Either overtly or, just in the way that you sequence, so that there's balance in their class. I think it can be useful to teach students about things like progressive overload, how our bodies respond to our efforts, including the musculoskeletal system and the nervous system. In my own teaching, I have ways that I do this. You'll, I'm sure, do it differently, but I talk about, like, how do we get stronger? How do we get more flexible? By asking for just a little bit more, right? And your nervous system is a key player in giving you a little bit more of the flexibility that you have capacity for. And as I said before, your nervous system needs to feel safe and stable to explore that deeper stretch or that larger range of motion than it's accustomed to, right? So approaching your stretches with curiosity rather than force might be the way that you talk to your students about that. You could talk to your students about the Goldilocks method. Not too much, not too little, just right. Yeah. And definitely talk to your students about different body designs and how and why some bodies don't do the same thing as others. And it's not always about flexibility or strength building, right? So those are some things that you can be talking to your students about, not all at once, little by little. And that goes back to, like, the class culture that you're creating. These are things you might talk overtly about in class. They might be things that you write blog posts about for your students or your social media posts. They might be themes that you weave into your classes. There's lots of different ways that you can do this educating in little bits over a long period of time. I think it's useful to remember that movement science is still really evolving. Things change constantly. They change every 6 months. In fact, when Jules Mitchell was writing her book on the science of stretching, it took so long because every time she was about to finish, there was new science and it changed what she was writing about, which I'm sure was very annoying. But actually, she loves it and she updates her work all the time. So the science is always changing, and your experience in your body doesn't necessarily translate to someone else's experience in their body. For me, as a hypermobile teacher, I have to be really clear with my students. My flexibility doesn't come from yoga. I was born like this. It makes me look really good at yoga. It makes life really hard. This isn't a goal. And you've come with your own body, and how your body has shown up is just fine as well, even if you can't do all the flexy things that I can do. My flexibility has nothing to do with my yoga practice. And it has nothing to do with me being super spiritual. Clear with students that your experience in yoga might be different from theirs, and your goals in yoga might be really different to theirs. Your values in yoga might be really different to theirs. That's a whole other discussion we should have, in fact, because that's hard. That's sometimes a little bit hard. All right, let's talk about invitational teaching strategies. So obviously, your students may be coming to class with pre-existing injuries, with medical conditions, with those unique body designs or structures, with a different history of movement that might make them vulnerable or make them feel vulnerable in some aspects of lead movement. And I think one of our roles is to make space for all students to safely experiment with movement in their own way. And I say that there's so many things we could talk about with that, but just simply being in a lead class environment, for someone who's really accustomed to that environment, they've been to group fitness classes or boot camp or yoga class or Pilates, they're used to being in a group of people, having a teacher tell them what to do, and then you do what you've been told. If people haven't had that experience, that's a really big deal to get used to. That's a lot of information. That's a lot going on. For students to be able to safely engage in that movement, that's going to take a little bit of practice, right? So understand that how people are coming to class, they're coming from all different directions. Our role is to hold a space for everyone to feel safe while they experiment and while they learn. It's also really important, as we were saying before, to invite our students to get to know their bodies through the practice of yoga. Let them be curious and try new things and play and explore versions and different alignments to find their flow, right? I really like the idea of making our teaching a conversation or a collaboration. And like it was said before, I don't know your body better than you do. Can we try a few things to get a right fit? And you feel and tell me how you're feeling. I think it's really important for students to hear that yoga is not being about a good yoga soldier or a yoga robot, everyone doing the same thing in the same way. It is all about getting to know you better. And for that, you've got to be making choices, and you've got to be feeling and then responding to your feelings as a practitioner. And like I said before, take care not to impose your yoga goals or your values on your students. Do they really want to perfect poses and advance their practice? Or are they really here just to move, breathe, and relax, right? So stay in touch with why your students are in class. And to a certain extent, that needs to guide your efforts rather than your enthusiasm for certain elements of practice. Let's move on and talk about retiring some old yoga models. This could be opinion, but I'd like you to hear it. I think it's time to retire rigid alignment rules. They are made up. They are often simply based on how it looks, aesthetics. They are often based on how one dude looked doing poses, BKS Iyengar. And most have absolutely nothing to do with safety. So if you want to teach alignment focused yoga, I think it's useful to be clear about what is safety alignment or safe practice and what is yoga alignment or what is aesthetically based, what is about what it looks like, right? And within that, I think encouraging students to find their own alignment that allows them to experience the essence of the pose in their unique body. And what I mean by essence is this a pose of deep hip flexion in a seated position? How can your students find that movement in a way that works for them? Is it legs together? Is it legs apart? Is it sitting up on a cushion? Is it holding a strap around their feet, right? As long as the essence is there, let them play. Another thing is if a student is choosing an alignment or a version that you aren't familiar with or that you can't do, but they are feeling safe and happy and not putting anyone else at risk, let them move in their own way. I remember a time where a guy was doing triangle pose with his feet facing forward. And I went to correct him because that's who I was in those days. And he was like, and good on him. He was like, no, when I turn this foot, it really hurts the back of my knee. And I've tried all the things and it still hurts the back of my knee. So I just do this pose like this. And I'm like he's not going to die from that. Okay. Enjoy your triangle practice. Like, that's not my business. At that point, he'd tried all the ways that I knew to accommodate for what was happening in his body. And he chose an option. And he was safe in that option. It wasn't hurting anybody else. So have a go. Right? Just because it's unfamiliar or it doesn't look right to you, it's not something that's part of your yoga style, doesn't mean it's wrong. Okay. Another thing I want to say is perhaps let's stop having the most flexible person in the room demonstrate a pose for everyone else to observe. This is something we did for a long time in yoga. I think it's time for it to stop. It puts the demonstrating student in a really vulnerable position, and it encourages the idea that everyone should look like they do, and everyone's not going to look like they do, right? So maybe that's something that we can retire. I think we can also retire offering guidance or suggesting that there's in any way a right and a wrong, right? That there's a spectrum for every pose. And so what we can do is offer guidance and refinements and workshop versions of poses, but let go of that right, wrong pose management. We don't need to highlight errors or micromanage alignment. I think that there's a lot of room for us to let students do it wrong, safely, in the journey to finding their right pose, right? To allow them to have that experience of discovery. And lastly, I think it's time we retire phrases like practice, practice, all is coming, and you need to move through the pain, or in one of my teacher's words, break your knees to express the full pose. These loaded little cliches are very popular in practices like Ashtanga yoga, and in my opinion, they promote a dangerous and outdated culture of injury or pain as a part of a physical and spiritual journey. So to be clear, you don't need to suffer for your yoga, okay? Vinyasa flow comes from Ashtanga yoga, and Ashtanga yoga comes from a time and place in the 1930s India where it was the practice was very militarized. Everyone in straight rows, moving and breathing in the same way. And I'll admit, I like that kind of class. I really like being in harmony with everyone else in the room, moving and breathing together. I love that. That's a great feeling, but it doesn't necessarily translate well to the all levels drop-in classes that we have these days, right? That militarized approach to yoga left very little room for play. The fact of a yoga mat left very little room to play. This is your space. This rectangle, do not leave the rectangle, right? Left very little room to play. And I really love the idea of bringing play back in and letting our practice be more playful and a little bit more childish and to color outside the lines a little bit, right? Safely. We're not in little kid bodies anymore. I could sleep wrong and have my neck out for the day. But like, part of healthy aging is finding ways to continue to play and finding novel movements that get my body excited and my nervous system learning. And I love that kind of approach. And maybe we should be teaching kids yoga classes to adults, is all I'm saying. I'm running out of time. Let me talk about, if an injury happens, what do you do? Number one, I will have all of this written out for you. If you have to hop off this call early, don't worry, I'll have it all written out so you can review. Begin with risk management. That includes your physical space, student guidance on safe practice, and planning for practices that suit the class in front of you, right? We can all get excited about sharing cool yoga tricks or a fancy new sequence, but before you do, you might ask yourself, is this movement or sequence suitable for this class? Like, do they have the skill level and experience for the movement or the sequence you planned? Is there enough space, props, walls for this movement or sequence? Do students have all the information and support they need to practice safely? Am I able to support students verbally, visually, perhaps physically for this movement? And can I provide guidance or safety tips for students who might take this movement home to their practice, right? So those are some things to consider. If an injury happens in your class, what is your emergency protocol? You can't plan for everything, but you have to have at least a sketch. And some of you have training in this area. So, you know, your insights are really valuable in this. I didn't learn any of this in my teacher training. We didn't learn much back in those days. So I had to cobble together risk management practices through trial and error and like a lot of error. But like, number one, the show must not go on. This is a mindset that you must be ready to adopt. Don't let a student limp out of class without checking on them. There can be within us an urge to keep the class flowing, right? But you don't have to keep a class flowing while a student is injured or otherwise experiencing discomfort. So you can put them in child's pose, make sure that that student's okay. If a serious injury occurs, do you have a clear process for getting emergency services to your location? I used to always have a piece of paper that I could hand to a student in an emergency that had the number to call, because we have students from all over the world. It's 000, right? My brain just goes 911. 000 if you're in Australia. The location of where you are, the door to enter, so that you can hand off that piece of paper to a student to make the call, and you can stay and assist the injured student so that you don't have to manage everything. So it's good to have a little card or a piece of paper. You can say, call emergency services, right? Come back and tell me when you've done it. I think it's useful to have a plan for action if an injury happens. So first, ensure that injured student is safe and has a support person, ideally a friend or someone with first aid training, but someone to be with them to keep them calm. You need to calmly clear the room of extra people. have someone call paramedics. Maybe if it's possible, send someone outside to direct paramedics to your location. And then maybe have some helpers to move mats and bags out of the way so that they can come in. And obviously follow the guidance of emergency services. Once they arrive, do what they say. Be open to talking to students who might have concerns or strong reactions to an acute injury happening in class. And report the injury to your insurance company, your employer if you have one, your venue or organization if there's a structure that allows you to do that. You want to do some reporting. So I think it's useful to put these steps into place now so that you'll be prepared, so you won't be having to make decisions in the moment. And again, for those of you who have some experience as first responders, this is going to come a lot more naturally to you. This did not come naturally to me. I'm not a good first responder, so I have to have a plan in place, right? So consider, do you have an emergency plan? Do you have a sample injury reporting form? You can download one from the internet. Do you have that emergency call sheet? You also, do students have a clear grievance process if they've been injured, if they've got a concern, if they've got a grievance about your class? Usually the grievance process is for students to report to whatever professional membership organization you belong to, Yoga Alliance, Yoga Australia. They need to be able to talk to someone else about what's happened, and then that information can be passed on to you. Do you have an aftercare process? So a simple text to check on a student can be enough to ensure that they are recovering, getting the support they need, they have some space to talk or ask questions, share concerns, and hopefully explore a return to practice. So those are some things to have in place. And I've said all that, and it might be a bit of a downer. So let me tell you that in almost 30 years, and at least 30,000 hours of teaching, I've only had 2 really serious incidents in my classes. One, I drove a student to hospital with chest pains. And 2, I called an ambulance once for a musculoskeletal injury, but belatedly, because I didn't realize he was really injured. Like, he was like, oh, it's just a twinge. And I was like, okay, so I'm just going on teaching. And it actually took someone else in the class, a nurse who was partnered with him, to say, like, I think we need to make a call. And I was like, to who? And she's like, paramedics. And I was like, oh. So, I kind of failed that day. And now I do better. I hope to do better. I have more processes in place. I have had other worrisome injuries in class, and I've learned from them about putting safeguards in place and improving my teaching strategies and communication strategies. And for me, this is key, not letting myself or my participants get carried away when it's not the right time or place. And I refer specifically to doing fun, fancy things. It's not always the time and place for that. And my enthusiasm can sometimes tip me over the edge of what might be safe for that space. Serious acute injuries are rare in yoga and can be somewhat mitigated with safe practice guidelines. And in my opinion, it's better to move knowing that there's some risk rather than live a life without the highly beneficial movements and practices that we find in yoga. The consequences of a sedentary life aren't the kind of risks I want to take. I'd rather take the risks of yoga, but to reduce those risks as much as possible. I see them going over time a little bit, so let me close. As you can see, this is a complex discussion. I think that there's a lot of things that we can do as yoga teachers to understand and reduce the risk of injuries. I think that obviously to our discussion, key is education. equipping our students with knowledge and empowering them to make safe, conscious choices in their practice, creating a culture of safe exploration of yoga. And remember that our goal is ultimately to create a space where all practitioners can thrive, and that we can explore yoga whilst lessening the risk of injuries, so that we can all have a safe and sustainable journey in yoga. So I hope this has been useful. This is part of an ongoing discussion that we'll have, not just about our teaching strategies and class management, but about injuries specifically. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for your questions and your insights and your mere presence. Hello to those of you listening to the recording. If you have questions, concerns from this discussion or any other, please send me an email. I will let you know when the transcript is ready and you can review. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.